Well, I am happy to have on the podcast Bruce Fleming from Minneapolis, and he has just written an awesome book called The Book of Eden, which takes us through problematic passages in Genesis and shows us why they're actually not so problematic. So,
Right.
Bruce, thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be.
Your book goes into Genesis 2 and 3. So the story of the fall, creation story of the fall. And I want to look, I mean, it's an amazing book. Everybody needs to get it. I know a couple of months ago, we had Cynthia Westfall on the program, and she took us through Ephesians 5:33 about respect your husbands and how it doesn't mean what we think it means. And people were like, yes, bring us more where we're just looking at one verse. And so, Bruce, you're here to talk to us about Genesis 3:16 today, because I know how many people have problems with that. And why don't you tell us what that verse says, Genesis 3:16, and the context?
I'm building on the research of my wife, Joy. So Dr. Joy Fleming really gets the credit for discovering what's in Genesis 3:16. We went over to Africa as professors in a seminary there, and the African leaders said, before you do your doctoral research, don't do it on some obscure verse somewhere. Do it on something we really care about. So she did it on Genesis 2 and 3. And as she's working through Genesis 2 and 3, she got to Genesis 3:16, where God talks to Eve in the garden. And she said to me, there's no curse here in the Hebrew, Bruce. There's no curse. There are two curses, one on the serpent and one on the dirt. But God
Mhm.
didn't curse Eve, and God didn't curse Adam, and God didn't put her down, limit woman in any way in Genesis 3:16. And so I said, keep going. I want to know what this is. And she did. And so that's what we have in the Book of Eden. And that's why I think it's really important, because she just takes a look at the Hebrew words and doesn't throw a whole lot of extra theological implications. She just, what's it say?
Right.
One of the biggest problems we have here in Genesis 3:16 is that about 200 years ago, people started translating the first words in 3:16 differently. If you go
Mhm.
back to 1611, the King James Version way back then, they did okay. But in the last period of time, they've been taking the first four words in Hebrew and they've been smushing them together. And God says two things, but now if you read your modern Bible, it looks like he only says one very bad thing. And so one of the big things we can do is to take a look at Genesis 3:16, the first four words in Hebrew.
Uh-huh.
And then once we get that straightened out, we can figure out the other seven words in Hebrew.
Okay, so
So,
Jenna, just so everybody knows, the verse that we're talking about is the one where I'm going to not quote it exactly because I want you to show us what it really means, but it's the one that we think is telling Eve, you're going to desire your husband and he's going to rule over you. And that's often been interpreted as God's plan is for men to be ruling over women, or that the fact that men rule over women is Eve's curse. And
right.
so we see it in both those ways. So that's the verse we're talking about, just so everybody gets the context of it. So what are
Yeah.
the first four words in Hebrew that you're talking about there?
All right. He says this, uses the same verb two times: multiply, multiply. And when you
Mm-hmm.
end up saying that twice, it means I'm really going to do it. So whatever it is, he's going to act in line one. And then Joy lines it out that the rest of the verse is lines 2, 3, and 4. So what you're going for and what people really want to look at is lines 3 and 4. But we got to get line one first. So
Mm-hmm.
God acts in line one, and then he teaches her in lines 2 through 4. He's not doing anything more. He's just saying, okay, now this is the way things are now. Let me tell you about it. So
Mm-hmm.
when he says, I'm going to do something, really going to do it, multiplying, I will multiply, he tells her the first thing, and that is itzabon. What is itzabon? That's a Hebrew word. And he
Okay.
doesn't tell her much about it. He doesn't tell us, he just says, you're going to get this thing. And then in the next verse, when God speaks to the man, he talks about what it is. All right, so what is it? God says to the man, because of you, I'm going to curse the ground, and you will have sorrowful toil when you do field work. So she will have sorrowful
Like the
toil when she does.
sorrowful toil is its bone. So
That's itzabon.
okay, okay.
People people say toil, but Joyce says no, sorrowful dash toil. So sorrowful
Mm-hmm.
toil. What's that got to do with childbirth? Because most translations say you will have painful childbirth.
Right.
And she said that has nothing to do with childbirth. That has to do with work in the dirt with your hands, field work.
Mm-hmm.
So then she says the second thing, the second word, the fourth word is, I will surely multiply your conception.
Uh-huh.
And she says, Bruce, look at this. The itzabon links down to the man in verse 17. And the conception links back to the serpent speech in verse 15, where God says to the serpent, "You really did it bad this time, and she's going to have offspring who will crush your head."
Right.
And a lot of people call that the protevangelium, the very first announcement of the good news. When I
Mm-hmm.
first learned that, I thought, why would God give the good news to the serpent tempter? Doesn't
Uh-huh.
that's But what it turns out is that God introduces the good news and then he winds it up when he says to her, I will surely confirm that you're going to have conception. So she's not going to have conception that will crush the serpent's head, and she will
Mm-hmm.
have sorrowful toil because she too is working the cursed soil. And so neither one of those has to do with the end of the 9 months of pregnancy. Neither one
Okay.
of those, that's not about childbirth. It's about two things. You're going to have Itzabon and you're going to have Haron. You're going to have sorrowful toil and you're going to have conception.
Mm-hmm.
So bad news, sorrowful toil. Good news, conception. So that's
Okay.
what God says to her. There's no curse there. You're going to
So
have,
just to reiterate, the itzabone that God says she's going to have is the same word that God says Adam's going to have.
right, not
Okay.
gender specific. Everybody has
Okay.
sorrowful toil. In fact, the
Mm-hmm.
parents of Noah in chapter 5 of Genesis, they say, "Oh, we're going to have a new boy, a new baby, and maybe this one will help us rescue us from the itzabone, the sorrowful toil we have when we work the fields, which God cursed because of the man." Only
Okay.
3 times is that word itzabone used, and all three it has to do with the curse on the ground. No
Okay.
curse on the woman's body.
Interesting. Okay. So
So
we have
God,
pain in childbirth, but that was kind of always a given. Is that what you're saying? Like this, it's not about that.
that comes in line 2.
Okay.
So
Oh,
when
okay. Here we go.
when we
I'm
get
getting ahead.
when we
Mm-hmm.
get to line 2, God says, "Now I'm going to tell you about something here. You guys sinned, and in the day you ate thereof, you died. So
Mm-hmm.
you have both of you have mortal bodies,
Mm-hmm.
and He knows that she's going to give birth outside of Eden, where He's not going to be the midwife.
Right.
So outside of Eden, what's life going to be? So in line 2, God says, all the translations say, with terrible pain you will have children.
Mm-hmm.
But that word is etzev. It's a pun on the word tree, which is etz. And so God says, yeah, you ate from the tree with etz, and you're going to have etzev. You're going to have this, what I'm telling you about. Now, the word
Mm-hmm.
etzev, other places in the Old Testament, it's used, and no time does it talk about childbirth. It's a more of a general term. It is not related to childbirth. And so we're translating that word as with effort, you will bring forth children.
Okay.
Now, each woman delivers differently, and Joy
Uh-huh.
delivered with no painkillers, with nothing. She did it in a jungle hospital, and then she did it here in the States. And so she had natural childbirth, and we know that it takes a lot of effort. It's a
Uh-huh.
lot of work. But when we were in Africa, sometimes you're driving down the dirt road and it's muddy and you get stuck, and then everybody has to get out and push the truck out of the mud with
Uh-huh.
effort. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's this yeah, it can be painful, but it's effort. And so God says, now I'm going to tell you about what your life is as a mortal mother outside of Eden. With effort,
Okay.
you will bring forth children, and
Mm-hmm.
that's a plural children. The other word, seed, offspring, conception, those are all singular words. She might have been looking forward to just one child. So when he tells her about effort, he also gives her good news. So Joy found there's an alternating bad news, good news, bad news, good news, bad news, good news pattern that's in this verse.
Mm-hmm.
So in line 2, she will, with effort, bring forth children, which is great news. God is still
Mm-hmm.
confirming the blessing on them, where He blessed them in Genesis 1, and then He tells them to, be fruitful and multiply. So yeah, they disobeyed. They were attacked. By the way, I don't call this the fall. I
Mm-hmm.
call Genesis 3 the attack,
Uh-huh.
and Genesis 2 I call it bare marriage. I thought you might appreciate that.
I
So
like it. Yeah, they were naked and not ashamed. Yes. Yes.
where do you go in the
Yeah.
Bible to find out about bare marriage? You go to
Yeah.
Genesis chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to know about the attack, you go to Genesis chapter 3. And so he's
Mm-hmm.
telling her about the attack in line 2. And then he moves down to, okay, now your desire. So in line 3, he says, your desire, then there's no verb. And so you can put in is, then to your
Mm-hmm.
husband. All right, she's a newlywed in the Garden of Eden. What has her desire been in the past? Well, they've had, I don't know how much time, but they're great. They're on she's still on her honeymoon in the
Right.
Garden of Eden B&B. So here they are, they're having a great time. He looks in her heart and he says, he confirms, your desire is still to your husband. Joy
Mhm.
says your loving desire. Okay, your loving
Okay.
desire is still for your husband. People go, well, they say, well, what about in Genesis chapter 4? There's the word desire over there. That's not even about a human. That's about a thing, about an animal. It has desire. They have their desire, but you have your loving desire. There's only one other time that word is used, and that's in the Song of Solomon. And his lover is saying his desire is for me, which is it's great. It's a good thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
There, people go into the Septuagint, which is the old Greek translation of Genesis 3:16, and they come up with desire. But we've seen a lot of bad translations through the years, and I think at this point already, the Septuagint was already a bad translation of Genesis 3:16. Then line
Mhm.
4 is he will rule over you.
Mhm.
Now, what's the state of the man? The man heard God's words personally, don't eat from that one tree. Then he heard the serpent's words, because when the serpent speaks in the first 5 verses of Genesis 3, he uses the plural pronoun, you two, you all. So when the serpent is talking to them, he is talking to them both. And
Mhm.
then she gives to her husband with her. So they're
Right.
both listening. All right. So the man heard the words from God, don't eat. And then he hears the words from the serpent, go ahead and eat. So the man was under the rule of God before when he was alone. When he was with her, they're both under the rule of God. He hears the serpent and he disobeys the rule of God and he decides to rule over himself. All right, now man rules over himself and follows the lead of the serpent. And then when God says, where are you? The man comes out, doesn't say, that serpent over there spoke to me and I followed his word. He doesn't even mention the serpent. Instead, he blames the woman and he blames God. So he is rebellious and he's ruling over himself and he's kind of snarky about it. He doesn't have a good attitude. When
Mhm.
God talks to her now, he says to her, that guy who is now ruling over himself, disobediently ruling over himself, he wants to rule over you.
Mhm.
He doesn't talk to the woman or to the man. God doesn't say to the man, you go rule over her. He tells her, he warns her. So he's
Right.
got good news, bad news, bad news, good news. Good news, your heart is still good. Bad news, that guy, the greatest sinner in the world, he wants to rule over you.
Mhm.
And so in verse 20, when God is done talking to them both, we only have one verse where we see that they can do something on their own. And the man on his own decides to name her. And he uses a naming formula in Hebrew, which is kind of like the kings in England. They say, I dub you, Sir Lancelot.
Right.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
In Genesis chapter 2, the Hebrew is real clear. The naming formula is used, and he dubs the name, or he calls the name of each animal the name he wants to give them. So he rules over those animals and he calls them their name.
Mhm.
In Genesis 5:2, it says he called their name Adam. So they are Mr. and Mrs. Adam when God's talking to them in the Garden of Eden. When
Mhm.
he's done talking to them, what's the man do? He arrogates the name Adam only to himself. And then he calls her a name like he subdued the animals and dubbed them with their names. So he calls her name. Who cares what the name is? He treats her like the subordinate animals. He is ruling over her when he calls her name. The first thing he does is what God warned her about. Look out, he's ruling over himself and now he's going to try to rule over you. Now what's she going to do? She knows who's ruling over her. And now this man over here, he wants to rule over her. It's a terrible situation to be in. And it started right there with the disobedient, rebellious man in the Garden of Eden.
But she was disobedient and rebellious as well, wasn't she?
She wasn't rebellious.
Mm.
Remember, in the New Testament, twice it talks about Eve, and both times it says she was deceived. So that's a great point. Let's
Okay.
talk about that. Murder.
Mhm.
In my town, they're talking about murder, and they're talking
Yes.
about first degree, second degree, third degree. And so what's going on here is they're saying, is it first degree murder? The person decided to do it, or is it second degree murder? Um, they did it, but not on purpose. And there's
Mhm.
punishment for each, but there's a different gradation in the punishment. When God talked to the man, he made a curse because of the man. When God talked to the woman, he didn't put on any
Right.
curse because of the woman. And that's because he was a first degree eater and she was a
Uh-huh.
second degree eater. He did it on purpose rebelliously and she had to be deceived. Satan had to trick her and Jesus said he was a liar and a murderer from the beginning. So he came to
Okay.
kill them both, but he was a liar and she'd never heard a lie before. So she
Mhm.
was deceived. So she did not rebel. And so God says, "Look out! He's rebellious, and he wants to rule over you." She's not
Mhm.
rebellious. She has a good desire in her heart, and yet look what he's imposing on her.
Okay. So then, because the other thing that other people have told me when it comes to Genesis is Adam was told not to eat the fruit, but Eve wasn't told that. Eve only heard that from Adam. In the sense, does that matter at all or not?
You
because
know,
because God gave that command before Eve was even created.
that's why we started the Eden podcast.
Okay.
If you go back to episode 2 of the Eden podcast, or if you
Uh-huh.
go to episode 3, we're talking about bare marriage,
Uh-huh.
Genesis 2.
Mhm.
And then when we get to episodes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, we're talking about the what happened after the attack. She could have heard from God. She could have heard from the man. She got it right when she talks to
Mhm.
to the serpent.
Yeah.
So I don't think that, we keep looking for problems with her. When we were in Africa, we found out that people, let's say when a woman has three, four, five children, they usually come pretty easily by that point. You would know better than I would know.
Mhm.
But when you have your first baby, sometimes it takes longer. And we heard there was a village, and over in this hut where this young woman was having her first baby, the women were abusing her because she was taking so long to give birth the first time, and
Uh-huh.
they were rubbing red hot chili peppers in her eyes. They were beating her, and they were justifying this by saying you're supposed to have pain in childbirth. There's just all kinds of terrible things that go on if you think that Eve was cursed by God in the Garden of Eden. And there's all kinds of bad interpretation of New Testament passages too. If you think she
Right.
was guilty, if you think she was the temptress, there's a cathedral in France where our professor took us in, and here's a statue of Eve, and he said, "Look around the back, and there are serpents embedded in her shoulders, writhing down her back. She's got the apple in her hand, and here's this temptress. She's not the temptress. She's not rebelling. She's got good desire. She's not cursed." There are
Mhm.
a lot of good things in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3:16, and then people come up with all why, because God says to her, I will make you the combatant against him. I confirm the enmity, the battle between the serpent tempter and you. And so who's battling against her? Who would battle against the interpretation of Genesis 3:16? Who would add all these extra things and try and twist it? Throughout the ages, who's involved? I think it's the serpent tempter himself.
Right. Because I know that one of the translations of Genesis 3:16, I think it started, I don't know, I think it was Susan Foe who did it. You're probably more familiar with this than me. I don't know if it was late 60s or 70s or when it was, but she changed the verse to basically say that the problem with Eve was that her desire was to usurp Adam's authority. And so that is the essential sin of women, is that they're trying to usurp the authority of men.
Yeah.
And then because of that, he will rule over her. And I've read so many interpretations from people that are more on the, like, biblical manhood, biblical womanhood thing, that have said that, yeah, like, women's basic issue is that they are trying to take over man's rightful position.
Yeah, they say lots of things. I
Yeah.
remember when she first came out with that, she was a student and I was a student too in seminary at the same time. And then we've got a list on page 100 of the Book of Eden where we talk about the ESV and all kinds of translations and what they do with that part of Genesis 3:16.
Right.
Uh, your desire shall be contrary to your husband. You will desire to control your husband. Since your trust is turning toward your husband, you will want to just lots of bad stuff in there. But you know
Hmm.
what? This is not as bad as the ancient Jewish interpretations. They came up with 10 curses on Eve. So we keep attacking Eve. We keep attacking Eve, and we say, no, she's our mother. She's
Hmm.
great. And God, look, God gave her the blessing, and God gave her the blessing in Genesis 1 to be them. He gave it to them. Be fruitful and multiply. And then he confirms it to her, multiplying, I will multiply your conception. Now
Hmm.
she knows that her offspring will defeat Satan. When I took first course with Dr. Walter Kaiser, he got to Genesis chapter 4 and he talks about the first child. And she
Hmm.
says at the very beginning of chapter 4, I have begotten a man. There's no verb. And then she says, the Lord. And he said, there's two ways of looking at this. One is, I have begotten a man with the help of the Lord, or
Hmm.
I have begotten a man, the Lord. And he says, I think she believed that this was the offspring who was going to crush Satan's head. She
Right.
shows her faith. She shows her faith in the confession of Genesis 4:9. One,
Mm-hmm.
I have begotten
Mm-hmm.
a man, the promised seed.
Right.
Everything we learn about Eve is great. The kids turned out differently, didn't they? Cain
Yeah.
versus Abel. One
Yeah.
like dad, one like mom. And then Seth turned out great too. Another one like mom.
Mm-hmm.
So I give Eve a lot of credit, and I think she deserves it all the way down. And then, of
Mm-hmm.
course, when God says to her, I will multiply, multiplying, I will multiply your conception, that promise was ultimately fulfilled all the way down when Jesus was born through Mary.
Mm-hmm. But you're not saying that women don't sin or that Eve didn't sin. I just want
Eve,
to
yeah. So he says, the day you eat thereof, you shall die. So
right.
they both ate. They both
Mm-hmm.
had their eyes open. They both hid.
Mm-hmm.
They also came up with designer clothes before that. So
Yes.
yeah, so they did that. They came up with that. Why? Because they both knew. So they both ate and they both sinned. So
Right.
yeah, that happened. There's no question about that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So I've never heard that. I've never heard it that way. I know you had like you showed me before we started recording. You had like the lines. Do you want to hold that up? I'll get Katie to put it on the screen too. But
Sure.
yes, I will surely multiply your sorrowful toil and your conception. So that's the bad news, good news. I'll multiply your toil. I'll multiply your conception. With effort, you will bring forth children. Your desire is to your husband, but he will rule over you. Okay, and that's what the Hebrew more says.
That's
That's
it, word for word.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
It takes a lot of getting used to. I grew
Mhm.
up in good old church, and I heard all the things that everybody else has heard, and yet I heard things that bothered me, like why would the gospel be announced to the serpent? Why wouldn't it go to her? And then I found out, no, God confirmed it, part two, and
Right.
you will have that offspring. So there are so many good things in
Mhm.
Genesis 3:16, and yet people keep pounding on it. Remember, when you want to talk about marriage, you go to Genesis chapter 2.
Mhm.
I don't talk about the fall. I talk about the attack. All right. If you want to know about the attack and the consequences, then you go to Genesis chapter 3. Don't ever talk about the curse. There were two curses, one on the serpent body and one on the body of the earth. Those two curses. That's it. Theologically, people want to talk about the curse. No, there is no the curse. Later on, you've got the curse of the law. Yeah, there are things like that. But when you're in Genesis, there's only two Genesis curses, two Eden curses. And Eve
Mhm.
didn't get either curse, nor did Adam.
Right. Right. Interesting. Okay. Interesting. So he didn't curse people, he cursed the earth and he cursed the serpent.
Yeah,
Okay. And then he was just telling people what was going to happen to them from now on.
you got it. That's right.
Okay. Interesting. That's
Yeah.
that's that's brilliant.
And he assures her, you've got great desire. And he
Mhm.
tells her, look out, he desires to rule over you.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Well, Bruce, you have a podcast where each season you go through a different problematic passage. So you started it out with Genesis 2 and 3
Right.
in your first season, and then you did Ephesians 5 in your second season,
Ephesians 5 and 6. Yeah, that's
5 and
done now.
6.
Hmm.
Okay, and then next season is First Timothy
We're right
2.
in the middle. We're right in the middle. We're doing the first three chapters of First Timothy, and so
Okay.
we just finished up 11 and 12, where it says,
Uh-huh.
I suffer not a woman to have authority, and
Right.
that cleans up real nice,
Mhm.
especially then the next verses where he refers to Eve and Adam in the Garden of Eden, and
Yes.
and it's good. He talks about that, and he says it in verse 15. She will be saved through the birth of the child, capital
Right.
C, the birth of
Right.
the child. So
Right.
it's Paul understood Genesis 3:16 very well.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so I will put up links where you can find Bruce and his podcast, and the Book of Eden is available, I assume, on Amazon and
Yes.
everywhere that,
Yep.
yes, and I will put up links for that too. And that is wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been great.
Thank you, and I'll get back to reading my good book here, Flemi.
Awesome.